It must be so much electricity in this place because of all of the brain power we have with us today. So at this time, we're going to ask Dr. Jason Sellers if he would come up and give his presentation.
All right, so I will warn you, I tend to accelerate when I get a little bit nervous, so I'm going to try to pace myself here. There may be a few moments for deep breaths. On the eve of English settlement, Tidewater, Virginia was home to multiple sovereign peoples of unequal power, maintaining responsibilities to each other within a really dynamic political matrix. These are relationships that are constantly shifting. English colonists entered a world in which the balance of power initially privileged indigenous nations, who used that disparity to bolster their own strength and autonomy. English colonialism, on the other hand, envisioned building a top-down structure in which sovereignty devolved from a single source, usually a central figure associated with a specific location. But while this ascendant ideology characterized official policy, day-to-day colonial Indian affairs, through the mid-17th century and into the 18th century often, remained premised on a recognition that natives continued to exercise dominion over their territories. Tidewater Indians leveraged treaty mechanisms to maintain independence, even as English officials used several treaties concluded from 1677 to 1685 with Virginia Indians and the Iroquois Five Nations to assert exclusive English sovereignty and develop claims to represent Virginia Indians as their subjects. So part of my role here is to sort of widen our scope outwards a little bit and think about this broader region of which Virginia is a part. And so you see the arrows on here representing, oh, I'm a little cut off. Virginia would be below here. You do have Iroquois up here in the sort of center of this map. And then you have Albany, New York, which is the center of Iroquois-English relations, which I'll come back to. On its surface, perhaps most insidiously, these treaties sought to prevent native nations from relating to one another as sovereigns by inserting the English as sole arbiters of relations among peoples. On its surface, the 1722 treaty with the Five Nations appeared to realize this goal by completely marginalizing Virginia's tributary Indians. But the Iroquois rebuked colonial officials for excluding their native tributaries from the meeting, hinting that indigenous understandings of sovereignty persisted. Ongoing tensions over where and in whom sovereignty was lodged thus marked the century plus of colonial Indian relations. English officials working to implement policy that relocated sovereignty and thus redefined native peoples as subjects, while native communities rejected that logic, continuing to exercise their sovereignty both within and beyond colonial institutions. As we've heard from Dr. Taylor and Dr. Reagan, Native communities continued to exercise that sovereignty in meaningful ways as they negotiated relationships with their English neighbors and governed their own internal affairs throughout the 17th century. Native appeals to the colonial government presumed a standing within the region that demanded English officials uphold their responsibilities to protect Native lands and rights. However, white settlers frequently disregarded the mutual obligations established by treaties and colonial statutes. Colonial officials predisposed to be suspicious of Indians more generally and consistently pressured by settlers nonetheless sometimes proved responsive to the concerns of Indians they saw as subjects. These contrasting understandings of native stature damaged intercultural relations in Virginia, and English approaches proved just as ill-equipped to deal with larger indigenous networks spanning North America. Bacon's Rebellion revealed at least two major sources of friction between colonists and native peoples. As colonial officials tried to mediate tensions between white Virginians and their native neighbors, settlers' push westward into the interior brought them into contact with northern Indians with whom they lacked a history or the mechanisms for negotiating a relationship, including people with deeper roots in the region like the Dogue, as well as those like the Susquehannocks and Five Nations Iroquois, who traveled through it to raid traditional enemies further south. White settlers, already resentful of the scant protections afforded the colony's tributaries, now confronted additional native groups not beholden to some of these existing agreements, these treaties that were agreed to earlier, about which we've already heard. While the rebels saw little reason to distinguish between the two as targets of their enmity, colonial officials seized an opportunity to strengthen some key provisions of earlier treaties and statutes to further redefine their relations with non-combatant and allied Virginia Indians. Virginia officials leveraged the threat of northern intruders to further secure Virginia Indians' compliance, even as they coordinated diplomacy with neighboring colonies to centralize British colonial Indian affairs and hopefully halt this series of raids into Virginia. This dual-track approach to Indian affairs in the 1670s and 1680s produced treaties with Virginia Indians and the Iroquois Five Nations that extended efforts to subvert native sovereignty, albeit with uneven effects. Concluded between Virginia's government and several native nations following Bacon's Rebellion, the 1677 Treaty of Middle Plantation framed the just rights of Virginia Indians as conditional, not inherent. For instance, the treaty did provide that no English shall seat or plant nearer than 3 miles of any Indian town, and promised that Indians have and enjoy their wonted conveniences of oystering, fishing, gathering tuckahoe, curtenimons, wild oats, rushes, puccoon, or anything else for their natural support, not useful to the English, upon the English dividends. So Indians would hold their lands and have the same confirmed to them and their posterity by patent under the seal of His Majesty's colony, as Dr. Reagan's discussed already. These protections ignored expansive ancestral homelands and even ignored that 1646 treaty that had reserved lands north of the York River to Indians, recasting most land as English dividends by default and the native presence there as exceptional. It accommodated native land needs by linking usage to subjection to an English sovereign through whom Indians could access land in return for a quit rent, essentially just like any other English subject. Indians could fish and forage beyond those territorial cores if they first obtained permission. But the treaty's logic dismissed native histories of ownership and detached resources from the lands that produced them to avoid implying inherent land rights. Moreover, the treaty gave English colonists first claim to resources and limited Indians to subsistence rather than commercial activities. Finally, the guarantee that Indians would be well secured and defended in their persons, goods, and properties, with recourse to the governor should those be violated, shifted responsibility for maintaining those productions from native communities themselves to an English government acting on their behalf. This series of provisions thus redefined multiple related rights inherent to sovereign peoples in their homelands as contingent, discrete privileges granted to compliant subjects of a colonial government. Essentially, it cast them as passive recipients of English largesse on land that didn't belong to them. The 1677 treaty made similar moves to redefine power and authority in native communities. Certainly, it acknowledged a right to self-governance, stipulating that each Indian king and queen have equal power to govern their own people. But in focusing on the individuals who signed and emphasizing that the respective Indian kings and queens do from henceforth acknowledge to have their immediate dependency on and own all subjection to the great King of England, the treaty elevated an English model of authority possessed by a single figure over a native model in which support emanated upward from a broader community that authorized that leadership to act. That leadership would be reauthorized only when every Indian king and queen with some of their great men shall tender their obedience to the Right Honorable His Majesty's Governor at the place of his residence to pay an annual tribute. Together, these requirements tried to position native leaders as subordinates performing their subjection by traveling to the seat of English colonial government and paying that tribute. Those articles supported a hierarchical model in which power devolved from an English monarch to dependent and subject native leaders who in turn exercised that authority over their followers. The treaty further ignored native notions of sovereignty in how it treated distinct nations. First, it defined the Pamunkey, Weyanoke, Nottoway, and Nansemond signers as equals based on their comparable relationships to the English government, rather than acknowledging any sort of dynamics among them, asserting none to have greater power than other. Second, it explained that Cococoesque, Queen of the Pamunkey, represented in the agreement several scattered nations who do now again own their ancient subjection and are agreed to come in and plant themselves under her power and government. Here, the English imagined a reconstituted Powhatan chiefdom in order to subsume under one signatory a number of groups they assumed had been and still were subjects, rather than independently sovereign people constantly negotiating a changeable relationship with a powerful neighbor. They also dismissed the need to include those nations in the peace as separate entities. They could be represented by someone else. Third, the treaty insisted that any disputes between Indians and amity with the English would be mediated by the colonial government rather than among themselves. Collectively, these approaches asserted English power to dictate the terms of relationships among native peoples, negating the possibility of independent formations of natives, their own independently structured relationships. Despite the wishful thinking of English officials reflected in the treaty, native notions of sovereignty remained in operation. Cococoesque complained in 1678 that she was very much dissatisfied with the Rappahannocks, but especially about the Chickahominies, who were very disobedient to her command. whether they objected to the treaty's presumption that they were subject to the Pamunkey, or that in failing to include them among its participants, it denied them the ability to formulate a direct relationship with the English. Both tribes rejected this imposed structure of authority and continued to act autonomously. A similar problem plagued the Virginia colony's efforts to address the second source of tensions on its western frontiers: English assumptions about restructured native relations complicating their ability to settle a peace with the Iroquois Five Nations to the north. Adroitly managing ties with the English, French, and Dutch from their geographic base between the Hudson River and Great Lakes, the Iroquois had emerged as a major political and military power throughout the Northeast. English imperial officials, hoping to consolidate Indian affairs, catered to the Five Nations, reinforcing their influence at the expense of myriad native nations over whom the Iroquois claimed dominion. In Virginia, colonial officials had long expressed concerns about northern Indians traveling the Fall Line and Piedmont, especially when their raiding threatened English settlers or tributary Indians. The visitors impeded territorial expansion and Western trade Virginia officials aspired to open, and they threatened to establish independent relations with Virginia's tributaries, which might empower them at the expense of some of those colonial settlers. The Treaty of Middle Plantation addressed a mutual interest in security by pledging the colonial government to defend tributaries against northern raiders, and requiring tributaries to share news of foreign Indians and escort visitors to English officials. But to better secure Virginia's western interests and fulfill pledges to native allies, Henry Coursey in July 1677 met with Five Nations representatives at Albany, New York. This was a center of European Iroquois relations that, in subsuming the localized diplomacy of the Dutch and early English eras, had already marginalized a number of smaller nations along the Hudson and Delaware rivers, as well as in the Ohio Valley. So we're repeating that pattern to some extent here. He assured the Iroquois, "We are willing that all what is past be buried and forgot, as long as there were no further injuries to any of our persons, including our Indians living with us," hoping that Iroquois influence over their neighbors would curtail raiding into Virginia. And I do find the phrasing here interesting, right? Our Indians living with us. These are people who we can claim, who are within the place that we sort of control and that is part of our English domain. Although the two sides concluded a new covenant incorporating Virginia into the Five Nations covenant chain, problems persisted because colonists neglected native notions of sovereignty. Virginia officials reported northern Indian incursions across the late 1670s and early 1680s, pairing descriptions of violations of English settlers with the observation that northern Indians were coming to Virginia to war with the Pamunkeys and Nanzatticos in the Rappahannock in 1682, and that a year later they had reduced and taken the Mattaponi Indian town and at present besieged the Chickahominy fort. Virginia officials had recognized Iroquois power in 1677 by traveling to Albany, engaging with each of the Five Nations individually, and adhering to the protocols that structured Iroquois diplomacy throughout the Northeast. However, they failed to return regularly to renew their agreement, and their efforts to designate a meeting place outside of Albany also undermined the treaty and suggest that English concessions to the Iroquois had been merely pragmatic, not actually a recognition that these native nations, including the very powerful Iroquois and Five Nations, that they still possessed sovereignty and could shape the terms of that relationship. Perhaps most crucially, Virginia officials had declined to include Virginia Indians as participants in that treaty at Albany, effectively excluding them from the treaty's protections and its provisions. Misled by their long history of using treaties to elide native sovereignty into presuming they could represent tributary nations before the Five Nations, Virginians hewed to the fiction that sovereignty lay only with the English throne, which could thus dictate relations among its native relations. Those native allies again featured prominently despite their physical absence when Virginia's Governor Effingham returned to Albany in 1684 to renegotiate Coursey's earlier treaty and agreement. Like Coursey, Effingham adhered to Five Nations protocols, traveling to Iroquois, deploying diplomatic metaphors derived from Iroquois culture, and recounting the Five Nations and Virginia's history together. Among the demands he outlined was that Iroquois warriors do not hinder or molest our friend Indians from hunting at our mountains, it having been their country and none of yours. There's some irony here in Effingham premising Virginia's territorial integrity on the historical claims of its native inhabitants. Doing so implicitly recognized their sovereignty, even as the colony proceeded in appropriating native lands and excluding Virginia Indians from participating directly in diplomatic affairs with the Five Nations. Effingham's strategy attempted to subsume Virginia's native nations as colonial subjects, deprived of the right to represent themselves while also appropriating their territorial claims for the colony's purposes. However much Effingham sought to erase native sovereignty in his present, his maneuvers failed to entirely relegate Virginia Indians' independent standing to the past. The Five Nations ultimately reaffirmed the terms of the earlier agreement between themselves and Virginia, agreeing to bury the axe and make a perpetual peace with the Virginia and Maryland Indians. But they also framed that peace as one reached directly with Virginia and Maryland Indians rather than with the English government claiming to operate on their behalf. The colony's council actually conceded in 1685, in one of the articles it is concluded that some of our neighboring Indians should this summer at the aforesaid place, Albany, give a meeting to the aforesaid Five Nations as an entire confirmation of the aforesaid Articles of Peace. They authorized a treaty party comprised of Appomattox, Nansadeco, Chickahominy, and Pamunkey representatives to visit New York. The subsequent meeting positioned these Virginia tribes as active participants in these multilateral agreements among sovereign nations and English colonies. Creating a relationship brokered by, but not fully determined by Virginia colonial officials, the meeting endorsed a version of Indian affairs in which Native people still dealt directly with one another, an implicit acknowledgement of their continued standing as distinct and independent peoples within what officials wanted to imagine was an English colonial world. The 1677 Treaty of Middle Plantation did take steps to secure protections for Virginia Indians, some of which appeared to acknowledge a degree of internal autonomy. But it also continued efforts to erode native sovereignty by redefining native rights as conditional and secondary to English priorities, and explicitly curtailing Indians' ability to independently formulate their own relations with neighboring peoples. Virginia's treaties with the Five Nations seized on that logic, claiming to settle a peace on behalf of those tribes the colony claimed as tributaries. Despite all of this, an indigenous geography of power reflecting this configuration of sovereign peoples independently relating to one another still clearly persisted. Virginia's native communities continued to act autonomously as they managed relations with their English and native neighbors and maintained claims to their homelands in the long interim between the 1684 treaty and the next treaty between Virginia and the Five Nations concluded in 1722. But they also witnessed the colonial government's continued infringements on that standing. The Treaty of Middle Plantation created the framework for both possibilities, serving as a touchstone for the colony's Indian policies, as when Virginia's council reiterated in 1700 that the articles made with the Indians at Middle Plantation be exactly observed as likewise all other treaties whatsoever. And every couple of years you see this reaffirmation of that treaty and those expectations. Even as the settler population increasingly outnumbered Virginia Indians, native communities continued to inhabit their homelands and defend their territorial integrity. They upheld their responsibilities under the 1677 treaty by arresting or reporting foreign Indians, escorting visitors to English officials, and joining patrols assigned to patrol the areas of Western settlement. The Pamunkey and Chickahominy cited that treaty when they reaffirmed those commitments in 1711, provided the Nottaways and Tuscaroras were forbid to hunt there. Along with Virginia Indians' successful request that officials remove colonists from protected Indian lands, these actions comprised a coherent strategy to limit intrusions while preserving ties to a larger domain that sustained native bodies and identities. In 1694, for instance, the Chickahominy cited their land's diminished fertility and lack of timber as they petitioned for a tract of land called Quinahomic that lies over against them in Pamunkey Neck, not improved and formerly theirs. Both subsistence needs and a history of possession justified their relocation to sustain their community, similar to renewed statutes permitting Indians to gather resources on English lands. Even as natives found the lands the colony recognized as belonging to them increasingly circumscribed, they were finding ways to maintain historical connections to those homelands. But if some of those experiences appeared promising for their independence, longer-term trends were more discouraging. One visible assault on native sovereignty came in 1699 when the council summoned the Pamunkey, Chickahominy, Rappahannocks, and Nansadecos, two great men of each nation. The occasion was a report concerning a peace they intended to make with some foreign Indians without the knowledge or consent of His Majesty's government of this dominion. They appeared and acknowledged that every respective nation of them had prepared a peak belt, being the token that usually passes between them when they desire a treaty of peace, and put them into the hands of the Nansadecos to be sent to the said foreign Indians. Expressing their displeasure, the governor and council demanded the belts be delivered to James City, where they could be recovered the next time they paid tribute. That the named groups acted in concert with one another to pursue this peace, with non-tributaries, with outsiders, suggests that they continued to use those traditional means to develop relationships both with each other and with more distant nations independent of the English, a clear demonstration of their own continued exercise of sovereignty. And yet English officials managed to subvert this process, confiscating the belts and undercutting their tributaries' ability to carry out diplomacy independently as sovereigns in direct relationships with one another. More, officials made the return of those belts contingent on the annual tribute, which, in addition to being that tribute payment, would require traveling to the seat of English power and essentially recognizing that as the seat of authority within the Virginia colony. And both of these were intended, of course, to demonstrate the subordinate station of these native groups. Despite their standing as tributaries and familiar neighbors who participated in the colonial economy and defense, and whose rights were ostensibly protected by a series of earlier treaties and statutes, Virginia Indians grew increasingly vulnerable. Although they continued to exercise sovereignty within the bounds of colonial Virginia, experiences across the later decades of the 17th and early 18th centuries clearly demonstrated their marginalization in colonial affairs and the resulting precarity of their situation. Though some tributary tribes elected to maintain those relationships with the English, others apparently saw little advantage in continuing to participate in a treaty process and tributary system clearly designed to disenfranchise and dispossess them. Ultimately, some of those groups withdrew from the colony's Indian affairs. By choosing not to participate, they effectively refused to endorse arrangements that English officials tried to impose, withdrawing their consent as an exercise of sovereignty in which they acted as independent peoples with their own interests and still possessed of the autonomy, the independence to make such decisions as a community. Virginia's engagement with the Iroquois Five Nations demonstrated its marginalization of Native Virginians in colonial affairs, but it also highlighted the persistence of Native notions of independent sovereigns operating within North America. And as 18th century governors promoted expansion beyond the fall line, they pursued further peace with Northern Indians who continued to frustrate those efforts as they had in the late 1600s. The strict boundaries at the center of these diplomatic efforts constituted an attempt to secure exclusive sovereignty across the territory the colony claimed as its own. In 1720, Virginia's Governor Alexander Spotswood, who you've got here, gathered the chiefs of all our Indian nations to secure their approval of boundaries he proposed to establish around the colony. As New York officials coordinated Spotswood's visit, they suggested that the Virginia Assembly send deputies and some of each nation of their Indians with a belt of wampum to establish and confirm a friendship between them and the Five Nations. What New York officials understood was that the Iroquois viewed this potential treaty as more than simply an agreement between themselves and Virginia's colonial government. The Iroquois saw Virginia Indians as peoples of independent standing who may have reached an agreement with Spotswood, but not yet with them. Spotswood disregarded this advice, however, arriving at Albany in 1722 to establish an everlasting peace between your people and ours, comprehending not only the Christian inhabitants of Virginia, but also the several nations of Indians belonging to and subject to that government, and presenting two belts of wampum, the one for the government of Virginia and the other for all its tributary Indians, sort of collapsing many different groups into a single sort of representative moment. Spotswood proceeded based on decades of English rhetoric and policy directed at relocating sovereignty from diverse nations into a single central English figure that could act on their behalf. Five Nations representatives contested this assumption, chiding Spotswood. "We wish you had brought some of the sachems of your Indians that they might have spoke to us face to face and have put their hands into the covenant chain," positioning the treaty as a multilateral agreement between themselves and a multiplicity of sovereigns. There are many different participants involved here. From a Native perspective, Spotswood's 1720 agreement with Virginia Indians did not preclude, much less obviate and make unnecessary, the participation of all of these parties expected to uphold the separate treaties' provisions. Though they ultimately did accept the belts and reach an agreement with Spotswood, the Five Nations identified Virginia Indians as sovereign peoples who should represent themselves in the treaty, which of course for us can recall those 1699 attempts to do exactly that by negotiating independently to the north. Preventing such a direct relationship, however, was exactly what Virginia officials wanted, consistent with decades of English policy designed to reduce neighboring Indians' independence. Lending its support to Spotswood's treaty, Virginia's Assembly noted its express goal of preventing any combination between the Five Nations and the Indians tributary to this government. On arriving at Albany, Spotswood emphasized that the principal article of the treaty was one declaring that the Great River of Potomac and the high ridge of mountains would be forever the established boundaries between the Indians subject to the Dominion of Virginia and the Indians belonging to and depending on the Five Nations. That Spotswood described the boundary as one between native realms is telling. The boundary would help prevent conflict between northern Indians and Virginia's native and settler inhabitants, but it also prevented tributaries from pursuing independent relations with the Five Nations by obstructing their ability to travel to Iroquois in a proper reflection of the power imbalance between those parties. In case his purpose wasn't clear, Spotswood insisted you should not at any time offer to treat with the Indians belonging to the colony, but through the government there. The English claimed the exclusive right to mediate among native nations. Geographically and politically isolating Virginia Indians subverted their autonomy by limiting their participation in expansive networks of indigenous relations. This was an attempt to isolate them and make them fully dependent on that colonial structure. The power disparity between the Five Nations and Virginia Indians was on stark display in 1722. Tributaries were marginalized in negotiations, dealing exclusively with Spotswood, whereas the Iroquois retained the power to shape negotiations, in fact, to invoke native Virginians as well as the resulting relationship. They could demand Spotswood attend them at Albany, insist he recognize their version of the history of English-Iroquois relations, reject his suggestion that they send hostages to Virginia, and include various constituencies in the proceedings. He has to negotiate with each of these nations independently. In contrast, the month after Spotswood's treaty concluded, Virginia's council ordered that Indian interpreters visit tributary tribes to share its terms, and directed the chief men together with some young men of the several nations to wait on the governor to be informed of the further articles of the treaty. The visits dictated the terms of the agreement through English mediation and directed natives to confirm it at the center of English colonial power at Williamsburg. Tribal sovereignty never left the minds of native peoples. Despite the best efforts of English officials and settlers, their efforts to relocate sovereignty remained incomplete. Rather, English administrators maneuvered to make sovereignty, and by extension distinct and independent native nations, seem to disappear. The tribes themselves continued to recognize each other and understand regional treaties in terms of a set of relationships among sovereigns rather than bilateral agreements. Tributaries who remained involved in Virginia's Indian affairs continued to exert what influence they could to shape relationships with the colonial government and other native peoples, consistent with their own notions of sovereignty. Meanwhile, tribes marginalized by this process sometimes elected not to participate, exercising their sovereignty by refusing their consent to treaties produced by a process in which they were not full participants. They refused to lend credence to a version of British colonial Indian affairs that centered only on Albany and Williamsburg, and in which their status would become contingent entirely on English mediation. Indigenous notions of sovereignty still structured those relations among native peoples that continued to operate, albeit in modified ways, within the confines of English colonialism, even as English treaty-making and policy worked to relocate sovereignty from native communities to an English center of power and monarch from whom rights and authority devolved in order to redefine native nations as dependent subjects with granted rights and privileges. Thank you.
Wow, that was wonderful. Thank you again, Jason. Now we're going to have Dr. Sam Cook.
Okay, thank you. All right. Wow, goodness. Wow. So let me see, need some notes first, but I just want to say thank you to all the people that worked incredibly hard to make this happen. Pat and Woody for your really grueling logistical work and for keeping a positive attitude, and Chief Ann for just spearheading this in the first place. One of the reasons I did want to, my flashlight came on, how about that? I think that's a sign. one of the things that really hit me today is this, and maybe some of you are with me here, reminds me back in the day when the Virginia Council on Indians had an annual conference, and just the feeling of those meetings, how important that was just for people to get together. And you have these presentations, but the important thing was that they were being communicated together, and there was unification. And I hope that that's the ultimate outcome of this summit and the accord to follow. So thank you for having me, and I want to say how absolutely humbled I am by my colleagues that came before me on this panel, because you did some hardcore research that has never been compiled in this compact text to really think of the important multilateral diplomatic implications, and what we miss by just looking at the written word as it gets codified. I think you've done more than I have, because I'm here with a strictly legal analysis, I think. So for some of the people in the room, it might be preaching to the choir, but for the rest of America, it's what people should have learned in civics, but they didn't. So, let me say something. Maybe I'll use my PowerPoint, or maybe I won't. I'll just evoke one of my indirect mentors, the preeminent scholar Vine Deloria Jr. And I say that because my academic genealogy comes through my mentor, David Wilkins, who is with us today. And so be aware that I share that genealogy. And Vine Deloria used to say he refused to use PowerPoint because he said, people who use it are seldom powerful and they never make a point. Now, with all due deference to my colleagues who made a really brilliant visual presentation, the fact is I'm a technophobe. And it was just 5 years ago I learned where to put the quarter in my computer. So, people, if you're my age and older, maybe you can relate to this, because we had to watch TV by candlelight. So anyway, so I'll begin with a vignette. April 15, 1716, the French traveler John Fontaine observed a meeting of Saponi leaders settled around Fort Christana in Brunswick County, Virginia, and Governor Alexander Spotswood. The Saponis and their kinspeople of the Monacan Alliance had agreed to settle at the fort under a Tributary Treaty, serving as buffers against so-called hostile nations to the southwest, while agreeing for protection from further colonial incursions. So Fontaine observed that after exchange of gifts, which of course was customary indigenous protocol, in a long period of silence, one of the leaders began to speak after, quote, they had all spit several times on the ground. Now, Fontaine's recording of this discharge of saliva was not too remarkable to him. He treated it as something that was not germane to the forthcoming negotiations. In fact, what it indicated is that the Saponi leaders and their Monacan allies understood that previous agreements with the English were solemn accords that required constant and dynamic reiteration. And I would argue that this account belongs in the lexicon of diplomacy and federal Indian law and policy. As Vine Deloria Jr. and his co-editor in their seminal work on documents of Indian diplomacy, as they note, federal treaties or Euro-American treaties tended to treat these moments of diplomacy as simple concessions, business transactions, as it were, whereas indigenous people understood them as very dynamic moments, as dynamic accords that required continuous renewal. So as many as my colleagues have pointed out before me here, indigenous peoples were actors and integral partners in diplomacy, whether Europeans realized it or not. And whether indigenous peoples understood European protocols or not, and they were usually somewhat in the dark, Europeans did not understand indigenous diplomacy either. And the fact is, Europeans did engage with indigenous peoples in the process of diplomacy and treaty making because they had to. They scarcely could afford not to, particularly in the early days. So what I want to do in this presentation is underscore the fact that indigenous peoples are agents, and I think my colleagues have already done that in a very brilliant way, but that they were and continue to be agents in diplomacy, whether Euro-American institutions acknowledge it or not. And I would also argue that colonial treaties that predate the American Republic remain valid documents that should be reassessed in the ongoing relationship between the contemporary American Republic and its subsidiaries and indigenous peoples. I do this by arguing and pointing out that these treaties and the concomitant diplomatic relations and documents and ceremonies that went with them really formed the basis of Indian law and policy as we know it today, which is a unique and anomalous form of national, if not international, jurisprudence that needs to be clarified. Certainly, American Indians are the only group that might be considered an ethnic or racial group that has its own set of entire title of the United States codes, Title 25. But that also underscores the fallacy of treating American Indians as simple ethnic minorities and ignoring their sovereign status as political entities beyond the pale of the federalist system. So I round that out by reiterating the fact that we need to reassess and critically understand indigenous diplomacy in the context of sovereign reciprocity, sovereign responsibility. If we understand that, then we understand that indigenous interactions with the federal, state, local authorities have always been acts of diplomacy and not simply lobbying activities. And I think the Sovereignty Accord that is before us is a perfect example of that. So policymakers and scholars who study treaties in the context of federal Indian law and policy tend to focus on those treaties that were negotiated after the advent of the American Republic, as if colonial treaties really have no bearing in contemporary law. But interestingly, the U.S. State Department maintains a cumulative list of treaties, all treaties in which the United States was a party, and those colonial treaties negotiated by the British that had an important bearing on U.S. diplomacy. The very first treaty on that list is the 1722 Treaty of Lancaster and Fort Henry, Albany and Fort Henry, as Dr. Sellers mentioned, between the Iroquois and the colonies of New York, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. This may have been the first treaty in which multiple colonies banded together to deal with a powerful indigenous polity. But it also marked a profound shift in treaty making, as Dr. Sellers pointed out, because it treated Virginia Indians less as partners and moved toward a more centralized policy that would lay the groundwork for future British policy and ultimately that in the United States. Now, as we've seen, the colony of Virginia engaged in a rather piecemeal process of treaty making with tribes, with individual tribes and sometimes with single leaders, indigenous leaders purporting to represent numerous tribes, but that was not always the case, certainly as we've seen. But as the case may be, these tributary treaties that emerged are deceptive because the term tributary in itself suggests a state of pure and utter tutelage and subservience, when in fact, let's consider that most of these tribes were also supposed to serve as military buffers, indicating that they had some autonomy. And we ignore how they may have understood these treaties. But by 1722, it was clear that the British were more concerned with dealing with power polities such as the Iroquois and the Cherokees, Tuscaroras to the south. By 1744, the Lancaster Treaties, Virginia tribes as we know them today, have been completely written out of that diplomatic process. And although the 1722 treaty had beckoned a responsibility on the part of the Iroquois people not to cross the Blue Ridge, implying somehow that they laid claim to some of that territory. The 1744 treaty required the Iroquois to, quote, relinquish and repudiate their claims and patents to all lands remaining in Western Virginia. The implication was that they owned those lands. So in agreeing to that claim, the Iroquois effectively gave away the lands of many of the lands of the western polities of the Monarchan Alliance without their consent to the British. So, but this focus on powerful tribes alienated many other tribes, not just in Virginia, but to the west, and created the tensions that nearly cost the British their victory in the French and Indian War. It made them realize a centralized policy was absolutely necessary. So, as the French and Indian War approached, tensions with Western tribes escalated. The 1752 Treaty of Logsdown, negotiated by the colony of Virginia, foreshadowed this because it brought Iroquois, Shawnee, and other Algonquin nations together in one last attempt to gain their alliance. But it was soon clear that most of those tribes saw the British commitment as insincere, with the exception of the Iroquois, and by the French and Indian War, most others had allied with the French. So the French and Indian War made it very clear that a consolidated, centralized policy was necessary. After the war, the British Crown then created 2 departments, then later one for Indian Affairs, to make sure that Indian Affairs was conducted through a central agent to avoid the inconsistencies that sometimes canceled each other out in state relations with indigenous peoples. And this policy became the blueprint for the nascent American Confederation as the American Revolutionary War broke out. So the Revolutionary War brought about a turbulent time in treaty making. Because first of all, it marked effectively the last time that European polities could play each other in the diplomatic game with indigenous nations seeking their alliances. But by the same token, as the war concluded and the British withdrew, Indian nations found that they lost a great deal of diplomatic power. But it was under this, in this time period, we need to sort of step back and ask the question why Europeans and their progeny made treaties with indigenous peoples in the first place. The simple answer is that it was necessary. It was the most convenient means to gain access to lands without engaging in costly and potentially unsuccessful warfare. And as we know, in the early days, European colonists were dependent on tribes. But in fact, there was a much older legal basis for making treaties with tribes that's found in the principles, if you can call them that, of the Doctrine of Discovery. The Doctrine of Discovery, how many of you have heard of the Doctrine of Discovery in this room? Well, not as many as I thought. Well, this is the beginning of all the trouble. The Doctrine of Discovery was an agreement between Western nations in the early days of the so-called Age of Expansion to try to mitigate tensions between these nations as they set out to colonize new lands. And it began with a set of proclamations in 1452 from the presiding pope and moving to subsequent popes, proclamations called Papal Bulls, which were essentially agreements between Spain and Portugal concerning the allotment of foreign lands. And these Papal Bulls essentially stated that the first Christian power to lay claim to a foreign territory could claim absolute sovereignty over that territory, a sort of first in time, first in right approach. By 1532, the Spanish cleric Francisco de Vitoria articulated a policy based on other clerics' determination that indigenous peoples were in fact human beings with souls and therefore capable of conversion, stating that European nations could not simply take land from indigenous peoples. It was not theirs to lay absolute claim, but it could only be taken by consent or through the conventions of so-called just warfare as defined by the church. Now, it's important to keep in mind because for the next 2 centuries, Western European powers understood this to be a tenet of international law. And I should point out that Francisco de Vitoria is the individual who literally wrote the book, The Law of Nations. So, nonetheless, there's no way were indigenous lands invulnerable to theft. And very quickly, European nations sought ways to circumvent the conventions of consensual land displacement and just warfare. And this became eminently clear after the American Revolution. As the young American Confederation assumed a very hard-nosed posture in Indian affairs, the Continental Congress and the executive branch, keeping in mind this is a nation built on a spirit of frontier expansion. We're no longer interested simply in peace with Indians, but in gaining access to land, particularly those lands in the vast Northwest Territory. And these lands, the Continental Congress adopted a philosophy of conquest, arguing that because they had defeated the British, they assumed not only authority but absolute title to those lands on which indigenous peoples lived, even if they had not been rightfully ceded through treaty. And by this logic, those tribes that had sided with the British during the American Revolution would be expected to give up lands without compensation. Fortunately, most people in Congress understood that war with tribes would be costly and potentially unsuccessful. And so they adopted a diplomatic veneer. And through the mechanism of treaties, which are treaties nonetheless, they pursued a sort of posture of eminent domain, but used treaties to placate indigenous peoples as they sought to dispossess them of lands. The idea was that as European settlers, American settlers moved west gradually, the game would diminish and tribes would retreat into extinction. George Washington himself articulated this policy in a letter to Congress in 1785 when he said, "The gradual extension of our colonies, of our settlements, will certainly cause the retreat of the savage as the wolf, both being beasts of prey." Founder of our country, right? But this policy quickly became fraught with problems. Indian resistance was imminent. The Shawnees almost immediately started repudiating the treaties that were to come. But let me backtrack and talk about some of those treaties. Even though the policy was one arguing the logic of conquest, we find that a series of treaties beginning in 1784 to open the vast Northwest Territory had a very, very harsh tone in both negotiation and in codification. The 1784 treaty, Fort Henry with the Iroquois, simply stated that the lands that the Iroquois had occupied west of Pennsylvania belonged to the Americans, quote, by right of conquest. The following year, in negotiations for the Fort Macintosh Treaty, when Algonquin leaders said that they were pleased that the Six Nations had agreed to give up some of their lands, the American commissioners bluntly said, quote, quite the contrary. They have not given up anything, but we have given the hostile Six Nations land that we conquered from them. And as the Fort Finney Treaty was codified the following year, it simply stated that the lands on which the Shawnees lived west of the Miami River were, quote, allotted to them. A similar set of treaties was negotiated with the Cherokees, Choctaws, and Chickasaws in 1785 at Hopewell, South Carolina. And in these treaties, it took a very similar tone. Article 4, the Cherokee Treaty, stated that the lands, the territory of the Cherokees was, quote, lands allotted to the Cherokees for their hunting grounds. And that's important because it ignored the very sophisticated civic organization and surplus agricultural complex that the Cherokees had had for hundreds of years. And like all the treaties of that period, it contained a protection clause that the Indians under said treaty understand their people to be under the protection of the United States of America and no other sovereign whosoever. What the treaty did not clarify was, or articulate, was how indigenous peoples understood that protectorate status, what it meant to be a protectorate, nor did it explicitly deny their sovereign status. So, as I stated, tensions were almost immediate. The Shawnees immediately repudiated the Fort Finney Treaty. The Iroquois, many Iroquois leaders were working to organize Indian nations to the northwest against the American Republic. And the fact that there is still a formidable British presence on the continent made it clear that unilateral diplomacy was a bad idea. So on the eve of transition of the American the American Confederacy into the Republic under the Constitution, we begin to see a more tempered approach. Secretary Knox made it clear, reiterating the concerns of many of his colleagues that failure to engage indigenous peoples in treaties was not only potentially costly and unsuccessful, but it was a matter of national honor. In his 1787 report on the Northwest Territory, he stated that it is presumptuous that a nation determined to establish its character on the broad basis of justice reject any interest in injuring a neighboring community whatsoever. So those sentiments became foundational in the articulation of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which is one of the most important documents in the formative years of the United States that most people haven't heard of, but should have heard of in civics class. Because this ordinance was intended to facilitate the orderly transactions in land and settlement of Euro-Americans in the Northwest Territory between the Ohio and Mississippi rivers. But Article 3 explicitly states, quote, this is important, that the utmost good faith shall always be observed toward the Indians, that their land and property shall never be taken from them without their consent. That really formed the foundation for the United States Constitution and its provisions for diplomacy with Indian nations. These provisions are still there. That has not changed. So as the Confederacy became a republic, as the Constitution was ratified, the founders encoded 3 very important clauses where Indian nations and diplomacy is concerned. The first clause dealing with who can deal with indigenous peoples. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, the Commerce Clause, gives Congress the exclusive authority to regulate commerce with foreign nations, with the various states, and with the Indian tribes. What that clause does is make it very clear that Indian affairs is the exclusive authority of the federal government, that states can have no force, no presence in Indian affairs. The other 2 clauses have to do with treaties. Article 2, Section 2, which acknowledges the power of the president, authorizes the president to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate, provided that 2/3 of the senators approve. Now, what this does is automatically extend congressional oversight over the executive branch. You can't make treaties as a dictator. But it also, even though Indians are not exclusively mentioned in this clause, there is nothing to distinguish Indian treaties from foreign treaties. And as the Constitution reminds us in Article 11, treaties are the supreme law of the land, right? So it would seem that the Constitution very clearly defines, and this has not changed, how Indian diplomacy should be taken forward. Why is it that Indian treaties and articles of diplomacy are not taken seriously? Well, the simple answer is erasure. It's a term we like to use a lot nowadays, and it's unfortunate that we have to. Indigenous peoples frequently reiterate the mantra, we are still here. Why is that necessary? Because erasure, colonial policies have always been intended to erase indigenous peoples, even in their most benign forms. Whether it's intentional or not, the image of the vanishing American, the vanishing Indian, is so ingrained in the Western psyche that it permeates the media and educational landscape. Indian treaties, as documents that remind policymakers and the uninformed public that indigenous peoples still remain as agents, are a prime example. As Delory and DeMelli tell us, over the years, the federal and state courts, in trying to reconcile the interpretation of treaties with existing public sentiments, have twisted the language of treaties to fit predetermined agendas. Now, the key term here, and I'm kind of going a little overtime here, the key term here is interpretation. Because the Constitution, in laying out the powers of checks and balances, have given the courts much greater power than most people realize. And when a decision reaches its highest possible form for arbitration, it effectively becomes law until another court reinterprets it or Congress overturns it. And yet, we don't seem to realize this out of the realm of Indian affairs. Perhaps we're starting to realize it over the past 20 years as the court takes some very restrictive views of issues such as eminent domain and bringing that into the private sector. But it's important to realize the power of the judiciary. The ink on the Constitution was barely dry when the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice John Marshall, issued 3 very powerful pivotal decisions, collectively known as the Marshall Trilogy, which arguably circumscribed all of Indian law and policy as we know it today. The first of these decisions, Johnson versus Macintosh in 1823, dealt with the question of land alienation. Marshall's court was asked to determine whether land that had been purchased in the territory that would become Illinois without the consent of the United States had been purchased illegally. It should have been as simple as simply rehashing the Commerce Clause, but instead Marshall engaged in a long philosophical pondering about the law of nations to ultimately reinterpret the Doctrine of Discovery to state that by right of conquest, Indians did not have absolute title, but only, quote, the right of occupancy of their lands. And this is significant, because it underlies the emergent trust doctrine that is really the nebulous foundation of much of Indian law and policy. So lands that are held in trust, such as reservations, technically, by existing law, are property of the federal government. The second decision, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. In this 1831 decision, the state of Georgia had tried to extend its criminal authority over the Cherokee Nation. The Cherokee Nation filed suit, arguing that state laws were constitutionally barred from their territory because they were an independent nation. Marshall basically threw it out of court on the grounds that the Cherokee Nation and Indian nations are not foreign nations, but, quote, domestic dependent nations, whose relationship to the federal government is much like that of a ward to a guardian. So that's unlocked some very paternalistic policies that have evolved into some very, very nebulous and dangerous territory for Indian nations. The final decision, 1832 case of Worcester versus Georgia, Marshall seemingly backtracked when again the Cherokee Nation arrested a non-Indian missionary, Samuel Worcester, for exercising his activities without a license from the state of Georgia. Marshall argued that state laws could have no force because Indian nations have their own sets of laws and unique modes of government, and only the federal government, Congress, has the authority to intervene in the activities of non-Indians. So these seemingly contradictory, confusing decisions nonetheless circumscribe Indian law and policy as we know it today, because these doctrines have really dictated even how statutory law is made. What does that mean? Let me just cut to the chase. Understand, just like the Doctrine of Discovery, the Marshall Trilogy was something that was ultimately articulated to mitigate tensions between non-Indians. In the Marshall Trilogy case, Marshall's trying to strike a balance between constitutional federalism, which hadn't really been tested, and states' rights. But these doctrines have had the most profound impact on indigenous peoples and not non-indigenous peoples, and yet they're also could be seen as the foundation for much of the law we know today. Johnson versus Macintosh is understood to be the very first piece of case law in the field of real estate. So, these doctrines, these cases gave rise to some very dangerous doctrines, and ironically, some of the most constructive doctrines in asserting the rights of Indians as agents. The more malevolent of these doctrines, the plenary power doctrine, came of age in the late 19th century. And the consolidated U.S. policy toward Indians was one of assimilation, cultural annihilation, and dispossession of collective lands. 1871, Congress officially declared an end to treaty making with tribes, partially on the grounds that tribes were perceived as being militarily weakened, and primarily because many in the House of Representatives believed that since tribes are supposed to be domestic dependent nations, they should have a hand in diplomacy with tribes. So for some time, Congress continued to make agreements that had the same standing. In the meantime, the Supreme Court and Congress engaged in kind of symbiotic dance that ended up framing an environment of sheer paternalism toward American Indians. In the 1883 case of Ex parte Crow Dog, the court actually sided with Lakota claims that a Lakota leader named Crow Dog could not be tried in federal courts for the murder of a rival leader, Spotted Tail, on the grounds that Congress had not taken that authority away from the tribe. So Congress swiftly responded by passing the 1885 Major Crimes Act, which deprived tribes of absolute jurisdiction over 7 and then later 14 major crimes. The following year, the court in U.S. versus Kagama affirmed the validity of this law in stating that, quote, tribes are wards of the federal government who rely on the United States for their daily bread and political rights. And this doctrine attained the moniker plenary power by 1905 in the case of Lone Wolf versus Hitchcock, which asked the question, could Congress allot the Kiowa Comanche Apache Reservation without the consent of the tribe? The Treaty of Medicine Lodge had dictated that land alienation could only take place with the consent of three-quarters of the adult men. But in this case, the court said Congress's power over Indians is plenary authority, which means absolute, and that it is a political power over which the judicial branch has no importance, no force. Now, in the same time, the courts were also articulating the reserved rights doctrine. This is interesting because this doctrine begins with the 1903 case of U.S. versus Winans, in which the court argued that the Yakima Nation, Washington State, continued to have fishing rights in the usual and accustomed places, even off reservation, because, quote, treaties are not a grant of rights to tribes, but a reservation of rights not explicitly granted away. Okay, I guess it's a good time. 5 years later, the court in U.S. versus Winters strengthened that in the first water rights case, which really noted that tribal leaders were cognizant of what they were negotiating, would not let go of the kind of water rights that would sustain their reservation. So these confusing doctrines tell us three things. First, the courts have always deferred to Congress, have never challenged congressional authority. Second, because these doctrines are so confusing, they do not, at the end of the day, justices are products of their own temporal, political, and social environment, bound to articulate these doctrines as a result of ideologies. But they also tell us that treaties are at the core of almost all of these decisions, and that diplomacy should matter, that treaties are the core of Indian law and policy. The problem is, in relegating Indian affairs to the realm of domestic policy, we overlook the multilateral nature of these. How do we correct this problem? Do I have 5 more minutes? I'm going to take 5. Is that okay? I can do this in 5 minutes, all right? So, numerous scholars of treaties tend to take a pessimistic view of the damage done. One of the most famous scholars, Francis Paul Pruka, takes the view that treaties were a Western imposition and became more authoritarian over time, and ultimately many ratified treaties are not what Indians understood. Now, what I didn't mention is that the courts also have many rules of construction acknowledging these anomalies in treaties that tend to work in favor of tribes. But we must understand, too, as my colleagues have told us, diplomacy was not a new idea to indigenous peoples, and in fact was a more dynamic affair that required constant interrelatedness, and that Indians had ways of preserving these diplomatic tones. So, Robert Williams, in his very important book, Linking Arms Together, reiterates this point, tells us we need to revisit those documents of diplomacy, which include the Treaty Council proceedings, even the rituals performed, and take a close look at what indigenous peoples were doing. Because, as he points out, in a rapidly complicated world, American Indians were attempting to apply their concepts of diplomacy to maintain peace and justice on a multicultural frontier. That's one of the main differences we have to understand. It wasn't staking out a silo in self-preservation. It was trying to forge a multicultural world. Gloria and DeMail reiterate this point and tell us, because of these deficiencies in the codified treaties and the fact that many of those treaties that were negotiated were never ratified, we need to pay attention to all prior negotiations and subsequent negotiations of treaties that follow indigenous protocol. So there's three very important points here. Prior negotiations, and this beckons the broader question. Do colonial treaties matter? Well, I think we need to consider international law again, because treaties are instruments of international diplomacy. And there's no question that that's what Europeans were doing. As colonial Virginia and other colonies are negotiating with tribes, they're doing it on behalf of transatlantic powers. And the conventions of international law, state succession is defined as the assumption of international relations by one state from another over the territory that has succeeded into the latter's authority, so that the United States assumes control of the territory of the British. They assume all responsibility for international relations. This is a nebulous doctrine, as international affairs can be. But, in some cases, this is very explicit in treaties of succession. The treaty authorizing the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, 1848, ending the Mexican War, all have explicit provisions stating that the United States will assume responsibility for prior treaty and agreements with indigenous peoples. The Peace of Paris, on the other hand, is conspicuously absent, that which ended the Revolutionary War, of any mention of indigenous peoples. Now, the argument may very well be made in international law that the doctrine of universal succession, which is one of the doctrines used to try to hash out articles of succession, would require the United States to assume responsibility for previous treaty claims, because it had not explicitly refuted those claims in international law, in the treaties of succession. And I would argue that Virginia Indians have always argued the point of succession through their words and actions, if not in those precise terms. For example, although it is not a federally recognized tribe, if you look at the Cherokee-Wakanataway website, they state very explicitly that they understand this 1714 treaty succession clause, which all of these treaties have, stating that they acknowledge their partnership with any subsequent sovereigns after the British Crown, that they acknowledge that as binding law. And, accordingly, they have reinstated the practice of delivering 3 arrows as tribute to the governor. But this practice has been going on with tribes such as the Pamunkey and Mattaponi for many years, which beckons the second question from Deloria DeMare. Do we consider successive acts of diplomacy And certainly from an indigenous perspective, that is happening and always has. The Pamunkey and Mattaponi since 1677 have consistently delivered tribute in the form of game in their fulfillment of the 1677 treaty. And this isn't just a tradition, it is an acknowledgement that diplomacy is a multilateral affair, that they have held up their end even if the Commonwealth did not. And which brings us to a third point, is this going on in the present? Yes, it is. Yes, it is. The sheer act of pursuing federal recognition is an act of diplomatic discourse. And to think that tribes would pursue it, tribal leaders would pursue recognition simply because they might get special benefits is flawed thinking, because the process of pursuing it would remedy that kind of thinking. It's an act of responsibility. To take that responsibility for their people, and not just for their people, but for people that they have to interact with. The Thomasina E. Jordan Act of 2017, which acknowledges the recognition of 6 of the tribes, is replete with diplomatic language. That's what it's all about, is reminding our policymakers that the relationship has always been multilateral, even if they would not see it as such. For example, Section 101 reiterates the moments when Chickahominy leadership throughout the 1930s and 40s corresponded with John Collier, the Commissioner of Indian Affairs, who was very evidently interested in dealing with them to the best extent that he could. It's diplomatic discourse, which brings us to the accord that is at hand. This accord, the Tribal Nations Commonwealth Sovereignty Accord, is coming to you from the chiefs of the 7 federally recognized tribes. And it is a call to action of multiple players. It's an accord that shouldn't require legal grounding because it's based on a philosophy of mutual respect and responsibility. And this is a remarkable moment. As the preamble states, it is intended to, quote, create a context for lasting government-to-government relationships based on respect, responsibility, commitment, and consent. It's a very positive compact that asks people to come to the table on a regular basis to talk, to reiterate a bond that should be understood as nothing less than some form of kinship. So I'm going to cut it off from there. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sam. Could we give him another round of applause? That was amazing. Thank you, panelists, so much for the morning session. I will now take a commercial break to acknowledge and thank our sponsors, the Virginia Department of Housing and Community Development. Don't know where your table is. Raise a hand if someone is here. Okay, there you are, Mona. Good to see you. Thank you guys for your contribution to support this important event. Riggins Motor Company out of Poquoson, Virginia. Thank you so much for supporting this important event. The University of Richmond, Jepson School of Leadership Studies. Thank you so much for supporting this event. Where are the rest of my sponsors at? Hold on a minute. Oh, Cultural Heritage Partners. I can't forget you guys, Marion and Greg Warkheiser. You can stand, and they are a legal representation for 6 of the 7 federally recognized tribes. And Mr. Kiki Carroll, who is here as Executive Director of United South and Eastern Tribes and the Sovereignty Protection Fund for USET. Thank you so much for supporting us. Did I get all of them, Pat? Oh, the Shanti Foundation. And, oh, I can't forget you guys. The Shanti Foundation and VPM, who are our media sponsors. Thank you all so much. We are now going to go to lunch, and the buffet is here to the right. And any of you who would like to, there is a free access to the gardens during your lunch break. So please go and enjoy this incredible place. It's beautiful out there, and we have a beautiful day. So at this time, I would like to just offer a prayer of blessing over our meal before we adjourn. Great Spirit, we thank you so much for pouring out the blessings upon these tribal nations to restore their sovereign status and to restore their communities as you created us to be. I thank you for all of our friends and sponsors and those who have contributed and stood with us in the war for this fight, and that we have been successful in it. We ask you to bless our food for the nourishment of our bodies, and may it bring L'chaim, life to all of us. Amen and amen.